This episode is all about data and how to interpret data and where to get your data and what to do with the information when you have it. But before we get into the episode itself, Vanessa, I think we should share with our listeners where they can get great data 24/7 about puberty and beyond.
Oh, Cara, do you mean our new membership community at Less Awkward? Because
I do.
Everything we do is to make life less awkward for tweens, teens, and the people raising them. Yeah. So we hear from people all the time. I wish I could take you home with me. I wish you could have the conversations with my kids instead of me having the conversations with my kids. I wish I could call you in the middle of the night and ask you all of my questions that I'm not sure about. Well, the answer is now you kind of can. By joining the Less Awkward membership, there's an amazing searchable library with every episode, every newsletter, every short video clip, everything we've ever done. And there's an AI bot called the Awkward Bot, and it's based on all of our content that we've ever written or said or any of it.
Which is based on good data. And so that brings us to this episode. We adore economist Emily Oster. Emily led so many of us through the pandemic with her incredible deep dives into data about what to do and where to go and how to interact with people. She has led so many young families through pregnancy and early childhood with her books that focus on how to use information, really good information, in order to make decisions. And now she's got a new book out called The Unexpected.
We appreciate Emily's advice and guidance and level-headedness about how we can use data and also different kinds of processes to best advocate for our health and our family's health. And even though The Unexpected is actually about unexpected issues in pregnancies, we apply the principles of the book and all of Emily's past work to the process of caring for kids through puberty and caring for ourselves through the stage of life by marrying good data, good science, and self-advocacy for the best possible outcome. We know you will enjoy Emily as much as we do.
Because she's so smart and she's very funny and her data is amazing. Enjoy.
Emily, it is a privilege and an honor to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me back. I am so excited to see you guys.
Cara's like just giddily smiling in her corner of the Zoom room. She's like, it's the first day of school and she has a teacher that she loves. And she's just like getting ready.
Collecting my data on how excited I am. Exactly.
I was telling Vanessa, I even put on an adult shirt for you.
Wow.
I'm wearing
not adult pants.
I am wearing like running tights, but
one of us on this podcast might be wearing pajama bottoms, but just saying.
We'll never know who it is.
I'm not going to tell you guys what my husband wears in the gym downstairs in our basement because
find out about that.
But luckily he doesn't listen to this podcast, so he won't be offended, just other people. Okay. So we know you are the data guru. You are the empress of data. You are the divine data diviner. I could come up with so many other puns, but I'm scared that I'm going to wade into sexual territory as I want to do. So I'm going to stop.
Good.
But the point of all of that extraneous commentary was that there's gathering data, right? And we're going to talk about your new book, The Unexpected. And I want you to talk about why you wrote it. But ground us in this concept of when is gathering data a way of managing anxiety and like just being busy and doing something and feeling like we're not standing in place? And when is gathering data and looking at the data and pulling from sources really a way of empowering ourselves and becoming more knowledgeable in an effort to making good decisions?
It's a great question because I think that we can sometimes, and I say this as a person who loves data more than anything, almost use the data gathering as a crutch. Like if I'm getting information, I'm moving forward.
Right.
And that's not true. data is in service of decisions. So as people, we need to decide A or B, this school or that school, this intervention or that intervention, whatever it is. And before we ever start to collect data on one of those decisions, we must say what the choice is, framing the question. You got to frame, what are you choosing? And then you get data in the service of answering that question. And when you have the data, you stop getting data, and then you answer the question and make a decision and move on. So data is not bossy, right? Data is never going to tell you what to do. So if you haven't put it inside a decision framework, you're just going to keep getting it and getting it. It's never going to tell you what to do. It's never going to boss you to the answer.
You neglected to say data's not bossy, but we all are extremely bossy.
I'm just taking the first 60 seconds of this episode, and I am playing it to my mother, because when she buys a piece of clothing, she cannot help but collect endless bits of data about what everyone thinks of the piece of clothing that she bought in an effort to get an answer to should she keep it. And she can never get that answer because the data is not bossy. It applies to everything, Emily. That opening applies.
Do you want that T-shirt, Emily? The data is not bossy, but I am
on the back. It's got to be a front back T-shirt.
Next marathon you run. That's what I want you to, because then everyone will go crazy when you run past them and they're like, oh. Okay, so the data is not bossy because the data is in service to a question.
Because it's in service to the question, and because our preferences and values are different. When we look for data and evidence about our choices, it's going to be an answer to, what's the risk, what's the benefit. And it's very, very rare that there would be a choice where it was like, all of the evidence suggests that you do one thing, like it's a terrible decision to do the other thing. I mean, there's occasional things like that, but it's very, very rare that would come up. So when you get the information, what you have is this is the risk, this is the benefit, and then you've got some preferences or values or other constraints, logistics, whatever, that have to lie on top of the data. So that's the sense in which it's not bossy.
Right, because risks and benefits are all tied to our situations, our values, like a host of other things. And so the answer in basically everything we ever talk about is it depends.
It depends. This is why in a doctor's office, the underlying philosophy of any test that is ever done, any lab test that is ever done, is you need to know what you're going to do with the results before you even draw the lab. It's exactly to this point, right? That you can't go data fishing and then, sort of have in front of you a manifested answer for something if you really don't know the question that you're asking and you don't know what you're going to do with the information.
And you don't know what you're going to do. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
So I want to play with that a little bit. I was at dinner with my daughter the other night, and the future of the world was in her hands because she was trying to decide, did she want a hamburger or did she want a kale Caesar salad with chicken and avocado? I mean,
I've been to that restaurant with you.
Yes, you have. You knew exactly which restaurant. And so she was sitting there and she was, back and forth. And I was engaging in my most patient form on a, Friday at 5:00. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And she said, I'm going to flip a coin. And in the old days, we would have pulled a coin out of our pocket and flipped a coin. But what did she do?
You open up the coin flipping app on your
phone. She opened up the coin flipping app and she flipped a coin and she got the result of a kale Caesar salad with chicken and avocado. And she looked at me and she said, oh. And I said, you want the burger? And she said, yeah, I want the burger. And I said, let me ask you a question. Did you flip the coin in order to decide, or did you flip the coin as a gut check to confirm what you felt like you already wanted? And she said,
that's some good parenting, Vanessa.
Yeah, occasionally, I have my moments about once every 6 weeks. And she was like, that one. That's why I did it. And so when I was reading the book, Emily, I was thinking about that very question. Like, do we seek out the data to confirm what we already want to do? Do we do a test to get information back? Like, I only had an amniocentesis with my last kid, and you have that. And Emily, we can talk more about this push and pull, but the conversation about if it comes back with genetic abnormalities, what would you do? And my husband and I had the conversation, a theoretical conversation. And ultimately, it came back that we didn't know what we would do until we actually got the results back, that we were unable to imagine the choice. And so I was thinking about that in the context of the unexpected and like how often, more often than not, less often than not, is that the case where you actually don't know what you would do until you flip the coin or you have the amnio or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes up a lot in medicine. It comes up a lot in there's like a whole paradigm in psychology about, how that they need information to enable them to make the decision, even though the decision is the same. So there's like this classic example where like, if people don't know if they will pass the test or fail the test, they can't decide whether they should go on vacation. Even though if you said you fail the test, you want a vacation, they say yes. If you pass the test, you want a vacation, they say yes. If you don't know, you can't go on vacation. So there's a sense in which I think we have a hard time living with some kind of uncertainty or and we need some external signal to like force us into a sort of forced choice paradigm, basically.
Right. And we're willing to take bad data.
Yes.
Right. In place of no data because uncertainty makes us so uncomfortable.
And the thing that this brings up, so in the unexpected, we're talking about complicated pregnancies. We're talking about pregnancy, particularly approaching a pregnancy after you've had complications in a first pregnancy or in an earlier pregnancy. And one of the features of this is people often want answers, right? That's the question I almost always get. I had preeclampsia before. What's the chance it will happen again? What can I do about it? Or even more generally, like, why did this happen to me? Why did this thing? It's often a bad thing. Like, why did this happen to me? And in many of these cases, the answer is we don't know, or it was random, or here are some things that might have changed your risk, but ultimately we can't really say why this happened to you. And that uncertainty, I think, is part of the hardest, like almost some of the hardest stuff to live with. And in the book, I think so much of what we're trying to help people with, and this is what my co-author is a doctor, and he talks like a lot of his pieces are about how to navigate conversations with your doctor. But the other piece is a little bit of a counseling and saying, we're not going to be able to give you the answers you always want. We're going to try to help you move forward or help you make decisions, even in a place where you have to live with the uncertainty.
But I think one of the things that you shine a light on is also, it's really refreshing to have a doctor who says, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know are the three most powerful words, frankly, that can be spoken when true. And that goes in medicine too. And that's the tension in this book. Okay. What I'd love to do is let's do just if you can give a quick summary of the unexpected, which involves exclusively stories about pregnancy and complicated pregnancy and second and third pregnancies after complicated pregnancies. And then we're going to shine a light for our podcast listeners as to why, when we have a podcast that's about puberty and beyond, we are talking about a book about pregnancy, because it's very relevant, and it's not relevant for the reasons that people might think. So you want to start with the summary?
So the book is called The Unexpected: Navigating Pregnancy During and After Complications. And as you say, it is really intended as a resource for people who have had complications in an earlier pregnancy or are having complications now. Although I think the pitch is more, you've had this before and will it happen again? And what we do in the book is kind of two things. One, we start by giving a very general overview, which is in preparing for the possibility of another pregnancy, what is the information you want to get? What are some of the choices you want to make? How can you feel more in control of going into this process and have the information that you need to help figure out if there's a different path in the next pregnancy? And then we go through a ton of different pregnancy complications. So overall, this covers about 50% of pregnancies are affected by or end in one of these complications, ranging from, first trimester miscarriage, hyperemesis, postpartum depression, issues with birth trauma. We have a whole range. And for each of those, we talk through sort of my part, which is the data. What's the risk of recurrence? What do we know about treatments for this condition? What are the kinds of tests that might happen? What even is this condition? That's kind of an important thing, which many people are never actually learn about, even for themselves. And then the chapters have a section from Dr. Nathan Fox, who's my co-author, who I call Nate.
Can we call him Nate also?
Yeah, you can call him Nate.
Thank
you can
you.
call him Nate too. And Nate talks through how to script a conversation with your doctor to get to the decisions and choices that you're going to want to make. So that's the structure of the book. I think what I would say is we are very proud to have written it.
So we're going to take the framework that you offer in the book and we're going to apply it to puberty and women's health.
I love it.
And we're going to use the sort of structure that you set up. And one of the early issues that you talk about in the book is if you have a provider, right? So you're talking about this in the context of a complicated pregnancy. We're thinking about it in the context, I think, particularly of adolescence, where you're far enough along in raising a kid through this stage and you're realizing that your kid's healthcare provider is not the right fit for your kid, for your family. And yet the idea of changing providers is so overwhelming. I actually just did it a few years ago with 4 children and it nearly did me in. And we were talking offline earlier today about how I don't get stressed about big stuff. I'll get on a spaceship and go to the moon. It's all good. I'm super happy to do that. Just give me the stuff I need. But dealing with the 4 million forms involved in a healthcare change is I can't. It'll put me under. So how do we think about, and Kara's got some really important questions about the logistics and ownership of data and all of that, but how do we think about when this is a moment to make a change, right? What are the considerations of taking that brave, bold step?
So in the book, we talk about, we do start with this in the context of obstetrics. And I think one answer to that is if you need something different. Right. And in obstetrics, it's sort of obvious what this would be. So there's kind of higher level and sort of there's providers that are more familiar with complications and less familiar. So you might want to switch for that reason. I think in the context of puberty, there of course there are going to be cases in which, you need somebody who does more endocrinology or something. So in some ways, I think that's the easiest.
Yeah.
Because to say look, I'm really sorry, we have to switch because I need, a maternal fetal medicine specialist or I need an endocrinologist. It's okay. No hard feelings. But there are a lot of situations in which people want to switch because the doctor's not working for them. And that's hard because it's saying it sounds like you're a bad doctor. And the frame Nate gives us in the book that I think is much better is people could be great doctors, but not the great doctor for you. And you deserve to have a provider who listens to you and who you feel is on the same page. That is different from a yes man. And this is where I think that the tension is so, when we interact with our doctors, I really think about it like a melding of expertise. Even in the book, Nate is an expert in doctoring things. He has a tremendous amount of medical expert and clinical expertise and so on. And but a patient is an expert in themselves and what they need and how they want to interact. So somehow those things have to come together and you can doctor shop for someone who's just going to always tell you what you want, but that's not what you should want either. So it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, I have so much to say on this topic.
We know.
I'm going to start with that. Maybe the doctor is not for you. And here's a shocking thought. Maybe you are not the right patient for them. That sort of two-way streetness of it is really important because so much of the structure of old time medicine where you know the provider and you feel connected and you grow up or grow old together. So much of that has been stripped away by the medical systems that we have in place. And when there's opportunity for that, you want it to be a person you like and you connect with and has your value system and vice versa. And there are a lot of intangibles there. And it may take a little bit of, you might have to kiss a few frogs in medicine and healthcare to find your prince. Now, this book is wonderful. It is wonderful. And I haven't been pregnant for a long time. And I will not be having another pregnancy. And let me tell you, I found it fascinating. It is a great read. And it is a great read because so many of the sort of framing points, the tethering points that you come up with are applicable to everything. So to your point that there are easy ways out or easy reasons, low-hanging fruit reasons for why someone might want to leave a healthcare relationship, in the world of puberty and pediatrics, the most common one is a kid's body is starting to change, and suddenly they are not comfortable with the doctor who has been their doctor since they were a baby. It sometimes because the genders are not aligned, sometimes when the genders are aligned, there are a whole host of things that go into it. But early in my career as a pediatrician, I always used to have, when my front office would call to confirm an appointment, I would always have them say to any parent of a kid who is about 12 or older, Cara's going to do a full exam, and that includes, exam of their genitals. If they are not comfortable with it, let us know. We can always have you see a different doctor in the office. So just tell us. And sometimes people would change, and I never took it personally. I just wanted the kid to be comfortable. And this one family came in, and we still laugh about it today. This must have been now 20 years ago. And their 16-year-old, we had this great visit, and I'm asking him all these questions. And, we're talking about nutrition and exercise and sleep and and I listened to his heart and I listened to his lungs. And now it's time for me to do a genital exam. And at this point, his mom has stepped out of the room, right? He's 16. I'm examining him one-on-one. And I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And he looks at me, he goes, no way. And he jumped up off the exam table, put his back to the wall, crossed his arms, and he was like, you are not touching me. And I said, okay, I love this because you're clearly in control of your body. But I have to do an exam.
Or somebody else has to.
Or somebody else has. Because, right, there's value to this.
Yeah.
When I tell you, he did not give in. I think it was like a solid hour. I said, I'm going to leave you in this exam room. You figure out who you want to examine you, and then just stick your head out and let us know. And he is now a grown-up who lives in my neighborhood. I still see his parents all the time. And every time he's like, you remember the time that I said, get away from me, you're not my doctor. So that is a great example. And it was totally legit. And there are versions of that across every type of doctoring and every sort of scenario. So it may be that a style of intervention is not comfortable to you. It may be that the approach feels too liberal, or the approach feels too antibiotic oriented, or the approach for it's all fair game. However, one of the problems, and I think you address this very beautifully, is there's this tension between the reason, the sort of intangibles about what someone does and doesn't click with a healthcare provider, and then the sort of the best medicine, the best way through.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I would sort of say that the origin of some of this tension is this idea, which is very good in principle and sounds great when you say the words, of like shared decision-making. Because we want to share. Sharing is caring. And shared decision-making seems much better than like 1950s, like the doctor knows best and he comes in with his cigarette and like points to a few things and everything goes fine. Like, we want to be making decisions. The problem with that is, I think, on both sides. So I think one thing is sometimes doctors hear that as like, I'm going to tell you, like, do you want A or do you want B? Without really like providing you enough, any sense of like what I would recommend or how to think about A and B. It's just sort of like, well, there's two choices, take out your appendix or not take out your appendix. Like, well, I'd like to understand, am I using it actively? Or is there, it's not quite that extreme, but I think even in many of these cases, it can get presented as, do you want A and do you want B? And patients feel like, well, I don't know. I thought you would help me make this decision, or I thought you would tell me. And then on the flip side, patients will come in with, I've done my own research in a way that is I wouldn't want to, in some ways I wouldn't want to discourage, but I think can come in with not, I've done my own research, but I've made my own decision. Mm-hmm. And I know what I want. And then when the doctor says, well, actually, like, medically, you're not, so classic example of where this comes up is whether you should have a VBAC after a C-section, which is something we talk about in the book. And, a patient who comes in and says, like, I have made the decision to have a VBAC, and the doctor wants to say, look, you had a kind of incision that makes that like super risky, or like, you've had 3 cesarean sections, and this is actually really not gonna very likely to be successful. That information should be brought into your decision. On the flip side, a patient who comes in and says, I'm not really sure, can't really be faced with like, well, it's up to you. Like both options are great without understanding what's the risk, how much should I think about the risk? How should I think about the probability of success? So that's a classic example where there's two kinds of expertise and we have to have them together. And shared decision-making isn't like, it has to be actually shared.
Well, and in the world of obstetrics, it's a particularly fraught example. Having a baby, carrying a pregnancy, and actually delivering a baby is a very big deal, physiologically and medically.
Really?
And it is treated like a spa experience sometimes. You know?
I want to have it. This is what I want to have be playing when the baby is crowning.
I mean, I had a patient once who brought candles into the delivery room and set them right next to the oxygen tanks. And I'm like, what is happening here? And she's like, I like this smell. And I'm like, but there's an oxygen tank next to you. So this is an experience where you, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, have a healthy adult patient, and you presumably have a healthy newborn who's about to arrive, not always, but often. And the downward pressure on the healthcare providers in the interim, the obstetricians, the nurses, the delivery room nurses, the midwives, everyone who's a player in this, they face a lot of stress in their job because they are taking essentially two well or fairly well entities, and anything that goes wrong is on them.
Yeah.
But
right?
Okay, so I'm gonna play devil's advocate here, which is when everything feels out of control, the outcome is uncertain, and literally, in this case, a human life is on the line, potentially coming out or alive or not. I understand the desire to find control somewhere. So when I was pregnant with my first kid, I was supposed to be billing hours, but instead I spent half of every day obsessing over what stroller I was going to buy. And at first my husband was like, what happened to the really logical, normal person I married, and who replaced her with a person who all they could think about was, what do I, should we get the baby buggy had just come out? It's too expensive. No, should we get the Inglesina? What about the McLaren? Right. It was on and on and on. And only with hindsight was I
you should have gotten the Uppa Baby.
Well, so Uppa Baby didn't exist yet, but
Okay.
I got the Inglesina and it was 100% the wrong stroller, 100,000%. I'm sure they have a very cool high-tech one that's much better, or they're out of business. I don't know. But I realized I was trying to exert some control in a situation where I felt like I had very little control, and the existential worry and the uncertainty that you talked about, Emily, was there. Now, when we think about, it's not actually about our health, but our kids' health, right? So taking the birth scenario and moving it to a puberty situation, and let's talk about one that has tremendous baggage, I don't know, weight and body shape and size. And so it's fraught. We have no control over it because it's not even our body, as if we really have that much control over our own bodies, right? And all of a sudden, it's a complete shit show. And so, yes, it's very stressful for the healthcare providers, and I'm sure all of the office staff, but it's also for the caregiver, it's almost insurmountably uncertain and challenging. And so I want to ground us, Emily, in the work you do in helping readers think about what questions to ask. We talked about framing the question. We talked about fact finding. And then you have the 4 F's in the family firm, which of course we love because there's 800 alliterations in there, and it's all very comforting and satisfying. So when we think about, we found a provider we think we like, we've made a change, and we have to ask questions, and there's technical questions we have to ask, but how do we know what a good question is?
It almost gets back to what we were saying at the beginning. I think a good question is one that is decision relevant, right? So when we think about what are we asking at our visits, either if you're thinking about like, what am I asking a new provider? Or if you're thinking about, I'm coming into the visit with my kid's doctor and I want to have I want to have a conversation that's productive. We only have, 15 minutes for this. And there's other stuff that has to happen as well. What are the questions that I have that are going to lead to something I would potentially do differently or keep doing the same? It's your point about like the medical test. Like, what are the tests we want to do because they would help us do something different as opposed to just like, let's pull a full blood panel, like for fun. It's like, well, what, there are things we'll learn about that. But I think we need people to come in better scripted to those conversations and with better expectations, right? I mean, I think the weight one is a really hard but important example because I think for many parents, they are surprised. Like you will come into your pediatrician and it depends the pediatrician, but I think many pediatricians, will talk about, your kid is in the overweight range or they're, here's where they are because that is part of the job of pediatricians to talk about that stuff. And for a lot of parents, that's a surprise. They didn't know that was going to come up. They're not emotionally prepared to have that conversation. They haven't thought about how they're interacting about their kid. And then you just get a deterioration of the relationship almost instantaneously because someone is feeling attacked and
that's right.
And then you kind of can't move forward productively.
Yeah. I mean, the most common situation I hear of parents of adolescents looking to change providers actually often circles around the issue of conversations about BMI, obesity, weight, overweight, underweight. That's the most common scenario that I hear.
And that feels like a very hard, I think, like as a society, I think we're struggling quite a lot with how we should talk about that. And so I can see why that would be a problem.
Have you done any analysis of the data around the sort of the obesity and BMI and the debate around the use of that data and language?
I mean, not in kids, but I think what I would say in adults, I've written about this in the context of adults. And I think the answer is, BMI is no great shakes as a number. It's just a kind of a random number intended one ratio of one number to another number. And it is useful for population level things. So I'm not sure, like we are way too interested in that particular number. If you look at the relationship between either BMI or some other metric of obesity, abdominal circumference, whatever you want to measure, if you look at the relationship between that and metabolic disease, diagnosed metabolic disease, heart disease, diabetes, et cetera, there's a positive relationship. It's not 100%. Like the R squared is not 1. There are on average people who have a BMI of 40 are much more likely to have diabetes than people with a BMI of 25. Although there are people with a BMI of 40 who don't have it and people with BMI of 25 who do. So it's kind of like there's a relationship there. There's signal, but there's also noise. I think one of the things I talk about in this one piece I wrote on this is like the correlation with exercise is much stronger. So we have much better evidence on like the role of exercise in promoting health than we do on the role of weight loss. Like, so if you're a person who exercises and has a BMI, like exercises in a reasonable way and has a BMI of, 35, you may act like sort of metabolically similar to someone with a much lower BMI. And I kind of like that message both for adults and kids because I think it feels more actionable. The advice like lose weight outside of the world of Ozempic is very difficult for people have a very hard time, both adults and kids with weight loss. The kind of like go outside and walk around in zone 2 for which is like a heart rate zone for like 30 minutes a day. That's doable for a lot of people.
And you bring up so many interesting things. There are so many examples throughout healthcare where we get a little early data. There's a correlation. As healthcare providers, we jump onto the correlation, starving for causation. There might be one article written somewhere that suggests causation. But then it takes 10 or 20 or 30 years and piles and piles and piles of studies to unwrite the narrative that this thing causes this other thing. Vitamin D is, for me, the classic example. I mean, the vitamin D data is just bonkers. It is so much correlation and so little causation. Right. And I go in for my regular annual checkup and they draw my vitamin D level and I laugh with my doctors and I'm like, what are we doing with this number? Because this number means nothing to me. And, we've all read all the data. And yet there's a narrative in there that you should have a certain vitamin D level. And if you don't, you should take vitamin D.
I take a vitamin D supplement.
Do you?
Even though I'm on record as saying supplements are stupid. And I specifically on record, both in public and research writing, as saying the vitamin D evidence is very poor. But someone told me it would help me run faster. And so I just take it.
Oh my God, you're
so
human. You're human.
Let's unpack that. A, does it make you run faster? And B, I want to talk about the sort of emotional side of, you've got data, you've got research, you have yourself written about it, and yet you're making a choice in not in opposition, but in going against the grain.
I think there's two pieces of this. So one is that I think there's a pretty strong placebo effect, and a kind
of like little kids who get new sneakers, and you're like, oh, can you run faster and jump higher? And they're like, yes, I can.
Yes. But also I have, part of what I find very interesting about the nutrition space is that the answer on some of these things is like, maybe they would matter a tiny bit on the margins. And so, I've convinced myself, here's the real reality, Tor, guys. I've convinced myself that I am performing at such a high level that even a very small, I can't even finish it. I don't know. Okay. It's just magical thing.
You know what? Elite athletes might need vitamin D.
That's what I'm saying. Elite athletes might lead. Yes. And since I'm actively pursuing my goal of being a sub-elite age group runner, I need the vitamin D.
There we go. Yeah. So to the narrative. Okay. So I'm gonna.
You're not gonna let me go down this rabbit hole for 20 minutes?
No,
okay.
Definitely not. Would you like to know my 10K time? No.
I don't think I wasn't about to ask you that very question, but Kara's not going to let me, so we're going to move on.
Okay.
It's going to be all the comments on this episode. What is Emily's 10K time? Okay, Kara, go.
I want to shift slightly only because we're talking about how healthcare providers are in conversation with their patients. Sometimes that gets translated into commentary in the medical chart. I have had that experience where when I was younger, when I was a medical student, I went to the student health services because I had a funky looking mole. In my head, I had every diagnosis we were learning about, like the rest of my class did. But I had this funky looking mole, and I went and I said, I have a family history of melanoma, so I'm just checking. And they left. That was in the days where they actually wrote with a pen in the chart, and they left the chart on the desk, I think, for me to see. And literally the only thing it said in the chart was, she thinks she has melanoma. And I'm like, okay. But this is the bridge I'm getting to, which is, let's talk a little bit about who owns what information. Mm-hmm. And when you decide it's not a fit for you, how you gather that information and where you should keep it and how you should get it and how it feels to be a patient asking someone who's taking care of you for that information, because all of those things are hard and complicated, and they sort of layer into this whole conversation that you have about how to manage your own medical journey.
Yeah. So you're entitled to your medical records. So you can ask for them. The hospital may require you to write something, but you are entitled to get your medical records. And one of the things we talk about in the book is in the context of these kind of complications, that is often very valuable in case you decide to change providers, even if you don't change providers, so you have your own records. But the asking for that can almost feel like an act of aggression.
Yeah.
Because it's, I want to see what I want to see the records. And then in a world of litigiousness, people start to think about, what are you planning to do with the records in a world in which you might leave your doctor? It's like, well, that's a whole other thing. So, and it's hard for people because whether you were the best fit for your doctor or not, a lot of times you have had a long history with them and there have been some good things. And you this is a person who has seen you naked most of the time. And to say that you don't trust them or you want this additional written record of what happened is tough. I think, again, I would frame for people, particularly if you have some medical something that is medical that is going to be in the records other than just this is a person who is in medical school and thinks she has all the diseases. If there's something relevant in there, you're going to want that. And you should want that. And that's the decision relevant piece of that.
Yeah. And I think you do a beautiful job of explaining it. Well, you just did verbally, and you do in the book. A few sort of important points to highlight for anyone who cares for a tween or tween. The legal guardian parent or legal guardian actually has the right to the medical record until the kid turns 18. When they turn 18, kids then have the right to their own medical records. Your medical records travel with you for life. They are yours. Your doctor's office or a hospital may charge you to get copies of the medical record, which is complicated because people will often say, well, but it's my record.
But it's the copying.
It's the copying. It's like it costs money to have
like
someone work in an office.
It's the mimeograph. It's very time consuming.
It's the medieval scribes scribing.
Exactly. Speaking of which, you may say, but all of my records are on computers and they're on electronic medical records. Can't you just forward them to my new provider? The answer is no. Many of these electronic medical record systems do not speak. They did that by design to try to one-up each other so that one would win. It ended in this mess that we have now. But for anyone who gets healthcare from any healthcare provider, so that's pretty much everyone, important to know these are yours. You own them. Now, sometimes people will find information in there that is not correct. That happens. There are mistakes in there. And so you may want to look through them and just make sure they accurately reflect the situation. Emily, I couldn't agree more. If there's been a complication in your life, you need to have the records that document what happened and what was done to resolve it, so that the next person who's caring for you has those records. And I tell everyone, make what we call, it's a terrible name, but make a problem list. So a problem list is a single sheet of any medical problem you've ever had in your life, just a one-line description. It can be the medical terminology or your terminology. It doesn't matter. But then when it happened, what was done to resolve it, and if it's gone. And having that little line sheet becomes invaluable, because then when you walk in to get care from a new provider, you're not rolling a suitcase full of documents, which makes you look a little bit untethered, but instead you can hand them one page and you can say, I've got records for you, but this is my summary sheet.
And make sure your kids know the answer to those questions about their own health history. I mean, when we were writing our health and sex ed curriculum, we realized that one of the standards was to do a personal health lesson for middle schoolers and to teach them how all the skills that they need to independently walk into a healthcare provider, everything from knowing their social security number to if they are able to know their health history, their genetic health history, their family's health history, all of those things. And it's really about empowering them with that information, including like the surgery they had when they were an infant or how they were born, like what the delivery was like, all of those kinds of things.
So the other piece of this, which I think is sort of relevant for the parents of the kids of the puberty kids at this age, is that as a woman, as you sort of age, particularly through menopause, perimenopause, et cetera, things that happen during your pregnancy are a window or a guide as to what you are at risk for later. So if you had gestational diabetes, you are at higher risk for diabetes later. If you had preeclampsia, that has some, it's not that there's a direct causal link that everyone who had this is getting this, but it is information you want to bring to your provider. And they will want to know that when you go to, your PCP, whoever you're seeing as an older adult.
So I want to tie that to, like, you're hearing from women now in the stage of fertility, right? Of having babies or potentially having babies. Have you noticed trends of information you wish these women had going into the stage of having babies, or foundational information you wish or they wish they'd had as younger people heading into this later stage?
So I think there's a couple of things. So one, and this is probably getting better, but there are many people who get to the point of fertility and only then learn how it works.
Mhm.
The kind of the way that your cycle is, how the hormones are working, why you have a period, even, some stuff which they should have gotten earlier, they aren't getting for various reasons. But even when we teach this and when we sort of do sex ed in like middle school and high school, we actually don't focus that much on the kind of fertility piece of it. I mean, there's a bit of this in sort of the female reproductive cycle and so on, but like thinking about, I wish there was a health class in college, which was like, here's how fertility works, in which we could talk to people about age and fertility and, how that relates, and not to be like, you better get moving, like your fertility, your eggs are drying up any minute now, but just so people have a sense. And that is a thing I hear, people sort of not really understanding that there is a relationship between age and fertility. And I don't say that to scare people or suggest that you can't have a baby at 37, which absolutely can do, but it is not as easy on average as when you're 25. And so I think that piece, just how does fertility work and what are kind of some of these relationships, that is something I hear a lot. And then when people start to get pregnant, then they are always very surprised to learn that like, you can't get pregnant all the time in the month, that like you have to have sex at the right time. I don't know, it's just like, that's like a thing I think people don't really think about because in health class, we spend so much time being like, you could get pregnant at any minute, could happen in the hot tub. And it's like, well, actually it's really only like 3 days every month. But it could be in the hot tub, but still it's only those 3 days.
So I love that we went to the hot tub example.
It had to get into this podcast. So, but you bring up a really good point, which is this is not new information,
no.
Right? How do you help people tune into certain types of data, even when that data is not super personally relevant or interesting to them, so that they can kind of project forward and be smart about making decisions?
No, I think it's super hard, right? Because it's like when I was 20, if you had said like, why don't you sit in this class about fertility? I would have been like, come on, right. I'm busy.
I'm getting in the hot tub.
Exactly.
I'm getting sex in the hot tub
with some guy. I don't know.
Emily, I'm going to ask a really small, contained question. Where do you wish there was more data on women's health? Like if you could magic a study right now, what study would you create?
Oof, that is a small question. Yeah.
Very small, very light. No political ramifications.
Let me give you a broad answer to your definitely very narrow question, which is that there is a class of under-researched questions which are about where the implication, the outcome is people's experiences. So we are very good at researching things where the outcome is not very good, but better at things where the outcome is a treatment. Here's like people are in the hospital with this and we want to figure out how to better treat it. In the space of women's health, when it is something that is like, I'm not going to die, but it would be better if I didn't have this. And that goes from, in breastfeeding, things like mastitis, is it better to have hot or cold? We don't really know that. That's a very knowable answer. It's a very easy thing you could answer. Should you be heating or icing your boobs if you have mastitis? But we don't know it. And the reason we don't know it is like, who's going to fund that? Where is the money for things that are just making people's lives better or worse? When we get into like symptoms of menopause, what is the right kinds of dosage, the right way to deal with menopause symptoms? How long should we, be treating people? What is this kind of hormone better than that kind of hormone? There's some research on that, but there's not nearly as much as there should be. And I think this is the space I would point to. And it is a space where the problem is money. The problem is just money.
But we have to figure out how to monetize, how to make the case for monetizing the solution to incentivize the study to be done.
I agree with that. Or we need to find another funder, right? So you think about, how does research get funded? How does medical research get funded? It gets funded through, the government, because someone thinks that things are important and like makes a fussy wuss up on the hill about like, we need to fund this. And I think part of our like big picture with this book is to say like, hey, maybe if we're talking more about this stuff, maybe if we're focusing on it and looking at it, there'll be a little bit more a loud voice for that kind of stuff. The other way that stuff gets funded is drug companies. And in many of these cases, it's hard to see what the monetization is.
Right.
Well,
I mean, I keep thinking about the Black maternal health
Problem.
the just shocking situation in
Terrible.
this country. Is there enough of an outcry to just make it a necessary public effort to deal with this? Or is it like still we have to make the case about monetizing even as women are dying and babies are dying?
One of the, it's hideous what's going on. And one of the answers, Vanessa, is that money also drives the outcry. In other words, when there are large lawsuits, when there are claims filed, when dollars are tethered to certain outcomes, then suddenly there seems to be a rush to collect data and a shift in the approach. And, this is where that community has been rightfully screaming and yelling, saying, pay attention and start collecting data and start looking at what's happening. And, the question is, when is there going to be some sort of legal action that costs someone a lot of money that starts driving some of that data? So the money piece drives every corner of this. And that's the worst look, and it's the reality.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So we're going to wrap with a really easy question.
Okay.
Because, women research on women's health it was too easy. How do we know when to put the data aside and to just trust our gut? Like, is there a moment? Is there a sign? Is there a moment where intuition reigns? Like, how do we listen to that part of ourselves that is instinct?
I don't see those as in conflict. So I think people often present this like, should I do the data thing or should I trust my gut? And the answer is you should know what the data says, and then you should do what works for you. And whether you want to refer that to that as trusting your gut or not, that's how you should make the decision. You should always make the decision based on what you think works for you, which is different from saying that you shouldn't have evidence that informs how you come into the decision.
So it's like you and your vitamin D.
Exactly. First, you should see that all of the evidence suggests that vitamin D doesn't do anything. And then you should trust your gut, which says you could get 1% on your 10K time if you took it, and you should take it.
I think actually first you should acknowledge that you're an elite athlete. And then you should look at the data.
Pretend that you're an elite athlete. Step 2.
Yes. Now we're all in sync. Emily, it is always a complete and utter pleasure to speak with you. You know that you are our data guru, and we are.
And you know that you guys
thrilled.
Are the ones who are on the other side when I need help, because now I have a teenager. So you are my gurus too.
I have an extra bedroom. So I'm just saying, if you need,
I need to send somebody to you.
It's my favorite age. You can deal with the babies and toddlers, and I'll take the teenagers.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.